what options do we have for improving cross-sectoral collaboration at an operational level? And then we're really opening it up to the floor for a discussion. So I don't know who'd like to start. Neil, would you like to start?
Well, I was going to talk more about why we need to work intersectorally in the UK. So I think we have a unique opportunity now to offer a coordinated UK input to the evolving global health security agenda. And one of the advantages of having a mixed group of people in the room today is that we can see the potential for interaction. We've got lots of experience in the UK about working together. I mean, so we've had disease outbreaks which have required DEFRA to work with public health, to work with Department of Health, to work with sort of, other key agencies. And it's that experience which isn't necessarily yet translated into action in other countries. So if we can bottle that experience of joint collaborative working, then it's something that we could include in our global offer to other countries. So one of the opportunities we currently have as PHE, we've just received funding from DH to support other countries' work on the international health regulations. Clearly, the international health regulations are based on the joint external evaluation and assessment at country level, and we want to very much support the World Health Organization to build capacity in other countries to achieve compliance with the international health regulations. One of the biggest challenges for any of those countries is to build these intersectoral collaborations necessary to achieve global health security at the national level. We'll be far more effective as an international player if, when we go to WHO to provide support to countries, we're able to demonstrate that we are already working with one another, and the mechanisms for joint cooperation and collaboration are these. But if we go separately as lots of separate ministries trying to provide our own separate bit of advice, then we're not really going to be serving the global agenda very well. So unless we can demonstrate that we're doing this at home, we're not very credible when we're doing this internationally. And for me, one of the big opportunities of this meeting, and potentially a bigger meeting in the autumn, is to identify how we can effectively ensure ongoing communication, coordination, collaboration between the many agencies necessary in order to realise global health security on a domestic level and also to support other countries realise it on a regional and a global level. And that's really our challenge.
Thank you very much. Any immediate responses to that from the room?
Thanks, Neil. I really appreciate what you're saying, because what we've seen very recently is the more management and more facilitation of say, exercises, both discussion-based exercises and functional exercises. And so when we go to these big tabletops now, especially in many countries in Africa, and we see the 40, 50 people sitting around from many different departments, different sectors, public, private, academia, sitting around and starting to say, here's the problem, here's the what if, this is what's going to happen, what are some of the things you need to do? That really has stimulated the drive to collaborate, communicate, but then, oh gosh, wouldn't it be great if we had a plan that addressed that what if? And I think it's maybe our imagination at the moment coming up with more of those sort of driven tabletops drills and being able to convince the client, the funding agency or the government that this is a necessary means of building capacity but also being prepared. But I've seen recently, every time we've done one, something fantastic has come out of it.
Thank you very much. Hold that thought. Moving on to Claire.
Okay, hi. With sort of what I'm hoping I can sort of add to this panel is that my approach to this is going to be looking at the more political aspects. So that's my background rather than necessarily the medical, veterinary and public health approach. And there's sort of two key points I want to think about for cross-sectorial collaboration and how to actually operationalise this. And the first one is we must have some sort of political buy-in at a high level to achieve it meaningfully, right? You've got to have, whether it's leadership at a national level or at a global level, you've got to have that buy-in to really make anything happen, right? You need to be able to harness the power of all the different organisations at hand or around. And without that political commitment, it's going to struggle because there's not going to be the incentive or the push for any or for increasing working together. And whilst in the UK, as we've seen, we've got lots of great collaboration happening, what happens when we then take that abroad, right? There's obviously a lot of tensions between different sectors being involved in global health security abroad, so it's about making sure there is political buy-in from different levels. And the second thing is more about, the second sort of idea that I've been thinking about is about trust building between these different organisations. So not only do you need to know, do people need to learn from the different organisations what they each do, I mean, which sounds quite a straightforward thing, but actually you might not know the intricacies of what different organisations can do. And kind of comparative strengths of why one organisation or one body should be maybe leading one area compared to another. But also get everyone speaking the same language, right? So in Ebola, one of the things we saw was the difference between clusters and pillars and the kind of fundamentals of simple things like that, where you have, people broadly agreeing on what needs to happen, but just languages being as a challenge to actually getting implementation of action. So thinking about how can we get everyone to sort of build trust and knowledge and between each other, so that it's a kind of preparedness exercise, so that then when an outbreak happens, whatever happens, people know what the comparative strengths are of different bodies, and that kind of there is this trust and not only political will but will between organisations to actually work together in a sort of comprehensive way.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thoughts on that from anyone? Vitaly.
Just on the political point, I suppose I would go into a bit more detail on that, and I'd be interested to hear thoughts in the room, because I think more about what we mean by the political buy-in and which political actors are we talking about. So we had some discussions earlier around involving not only ministries of health, but ministries of finance, ministries of defence, other ministries. So I'd be quite interested in that, because at the moment, obviously, we're at risk of this being seen very much through a health lens and being driven by health. But we know that health ministers often aren't the most powerful ministers in many of these countries. So I think it'd be good to delve into a bit more detail about that.
Thank you very much. Finn.
Okay, thanks very much. So reflecting on what our discussions have focused on today, this has mainly been about human health, and then, thanks to Trevor, a little bit about animal health and zoonotic diseases as well. So with the latter in mind, when I saw this question about 5 minutes ago, I jotted down a few points, and actually, Neil, you've covered a lot of these already, so thanks for that. But just to reiterate that we have a lot of experience in this country in responding to zoonotic disease outbreaks and preparing for them. In particular, there's a very healthy memorandum of understanding between PHE and Animal and Plant Health Agency, and the operational standard of that and how that MOU is carried out is in my mind and in the mind of others effectively a gold standard, seen as a gold standard across the world. And so I'd reiterate what Neil said, which is the challenge in the future should be for us to perhaps look at how do we use that as a model for other countries to follow. At a future meeting, I'd also like to see or hear a little bit more about how we can identify key areas for research and development that are of interest to both public health and animal health, and perhaps also learning from how we operate in this country if we're making recommendations on perhaps facilities developments for research and surveillance laboratories, etc., in developing countries. What can we learn from what happens here and what those countries might need in the future. Reflecting on what some people have said earlier on, I think it was Adam mentioned 4 or 5 reasons why we should really be involved in global health, and Claire, you also mentioned the contract between government and our electorate, and bringing them together. One of the reasons that Adam mentioned we should be involved is that we want to be aware of what's happening out in other countries so we can perhaps protect our own country from certain diseases. And in relation to the contract that the electorate has with the government, part of that contract is that we do actually protect public health and protect animal health in this country. So the point is that one of the reasons why we're interested in being involved is that we can find out or be aware of, if you like, horizon scanning, what diseases are present in other countries that might affect animal health that are of zoonotic interest. So something I'd like to see perhaps discussed at a future meeting is how do we prioritise those diseases? So we know which diseases are already present in the UK, we know which diseases we're free from, but which diseases exist in other countries though, which we'd like to not have in our own country.
So enlightened self-interest should drive the... Is that what you're kind of saying? Or in how to prioritise would be based on what are the threats to us are?
I think we should certainly consider the threats to ourselves, yes.
Thank you. Good point. Any comments on Finn's remarks? Oh, yeah, carry on. There's a microphone coming.
Thanks, David Harbour, Chatham House. It's really Finn and Neil to an extent. And it's about the UK offering the model that we have adopted, successful as it might be, to other countries. And there is a big risk. You talked earlier, somebody, about the US and possibly raising antibodies if something is seen as a US-driven initiative. My words, not yours. But on this one, we must recognise in the UK that we had a particular situation which helped create the model that we've now got. And part of it was post 9/11. Health always wanted a seat at the table. It didn't have a seat at the table, and then a whole range of things happened that created a situation where the government collectively, but particularly the Prime Minister, which was of fundamental importance, said, we will create this system where there is a lead department for a particular crisis, and all the things that people in this room I'm sure are very familiar with. But that doesn't translate into some other countries. And I just come back from a joint external evaluation, a WHO JEE, and the health ministry there and the public health agency would give their eye teeth to be in the position that the UK Department of Health and PHE are in. And it's not enough to say, this works, here you are, you might like to adopt it, because with the political backdrop, that is the huge, huge challenge that particularly some low-income countries have. Health doesn't have a voice, and health and agriculture might try and work together, but sometimes they're stopped from working together. So there are all those sorts of factors to take into account. So it's just an observation. It's a great idea, and I personally subscribe wholeheartedly to the UK model, as you might expect. But it's not just bottle it and give it to somebody else. It's creating that dialogue, the environment where there's a pull maybe from other countries to say, please help us get that dialogue with our head of state or with whoever we need to talk with. Thanks.
And behind you, thanks.
I'd go on from there. Again, it's thinking of it from the perspective of those countries. And we don't have much of a debate in this country about whether we should invest in education or in health. There's an acceptance that we're going to invest in both. There isn't even much of a debate about whether we should give so much more to health or to education. But in a number of countries, the choice is between health and education. It's not both, it's one or the other. I exaggerate slightly. But I think this comes back to the point, I think, David, your table made, I think. It's actually having the compelling narrative. And if we actually want to actually get to finance ministers, defence ministers, foreign ministers, heads of state, we do actually need this compelling narrative, which needs to take into account the fact that in a lot of countries, if we invest in health, then you have to disinvest or really prioritise much lower investment elsewhere. And therefore, I would wholeheartedly agree with that, your first suggestion, I think, of yours, that we do actually need this compelling narrative.
Thank you very much. Moving on then, Trevor.
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, there are sort of many zoonoses which are not actually diseases of animals, and there is no overt requirement on many governments to investigate them. And often when you control the disease in the humans, you're actually not reducing the risk of exposure at all. So it is really, I think, very important to stress the fact that, depending on the disease, of course, that a control in the animal reservoir is certainly as important as controlling in the human.
Can you give a couple of examples?
Well, one obvious one is Japanese encephalitis. Another is Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever. Both of these diseases occur both in wild but also in domestic ruminants, and yet there's no control anywhere that I know of in the world for either of those diseases in their ruminant host. So what they're focusing on is vaccines, but obviously that's not going to reduce the risk, and there's always going to be a population which is susceptible. Going back to the subject area of funding by donor agencies to achieve, or at least to fund research projects or projects in other countries, I think it's very important that a very sound financial and social business case is constructed with regard to any projects, because it's so important to make sure that both the impact and the outcomes of these projects is very clearly delineated and can be measured and hopefully also realised. We were talking about the differences in different countries and the responses of different countries. Something that we've certainly found is the experience in the area of animal health control is that regional approaches are so much more effective than national approach. And one of the main reasons for these, apart from the transboundary nature of many animal diseases, is that countries are almost embarrassed not to do something if all of their neighbours are doing something. So it can actually create quite a lot of internal pressure within a country if you can get a regional commitment. There was also mention about facilities and training needs in developing countries, not only for human and animal health, but also I think that there are also biosecurity and bioethics opportunities to embed there as part of any provision of facilities and training that, of course, deliver to the UK biosecurity agenda as well as to our international aid and UK trading initiative. And I think that where we can deliver to several government strategies simultaneously, it's that much more effective and that much more compelling. And finally, in the context of disease threats, I think that these are threats of overseas diseases coming to UK. I think we can be in the very privileged position of being both selfish and altruistic by helping to control these overseas, because not only does it benefit that third country, but it reduces the risk of them coming here. So I'm a great advocate of helping third countries to develop capability and control of animal and zoonotic disease.
Thank you, Trevor. Comments on those comments? Gavin, yes, go.
Thanks, Trevor. So we know that with the foot and mouth disease outbreak and we know the origin of that and probably how it came into the country, and we've
probably
yeah.
This is the 2001 you're talking about.
The 2001, yeah. So I worked for DEFRA in 2001 on that, and one of my jobs was to go out to the airports also to look at illegal wildlife trade, and lovely lady that went by the name of Mrs. Thompson from Nigeria had a gazelle in her bag one day and was bringing it in for a wedding. She slapped me on the back. "Oh, Gavin, this is the 5th time I've done this." And she, being the people who paid her to do that, she didn't see the risk. This was just a job for her. Yep. How well do you think our port of entry surveillance and detection is set up, and how do we? Is it as rigid as we think, or are we just being lucky? And is it something we can take to other countries?
There are two aspects to this. There's first of all bringing it in and then exposing it to animals, and so it's a double risk. It's a bit of, again, a Rumsfeld's unknown, but what we do know is that where I do remember a case where APHIS decided to intercept all imports of meat from, I think it was Croatia, subsequent with some disease outbreak in pigs, and they collected something like 76 kilos of pork in a month. So I think we have to be realistic and accept the fact that there is, could well be quite significant importations, illegal importations into UK. I think it's a fact of life.
And I think Joe and Ellie at APHIS called it the Blitz.
Right.
And with the Blitz, you know, that 76 and the other numbers, we just didn't have the resources to sustain that always-on risk assessment.
No, you're absolutely right. It was an exercise simply to make some level of assessment about what the risk might be. But as you say, totally unsustainable. I think that the main layer of protection is actually in preventing exposure of animals to those products, and that's where we do have quite strict controls. We don't swill feed anymore, not for several years, and we do have some level of separation of our animals from the public where we can. Although, you know, we are probably one of the countries in the world that does extensively rear, in other words, outdoors. So that risk is always present. And of course, there are diseases such as avian influenza where we'd have to cage our farms in netting if we were going to try to keep out diseases that are brought in by flying wildlife. So that is a problem.
Thank you, Trevor. Any other thoughts? I'm just interested in this compelling narrative around the motivation for investing in global health security. And when you're speaking to, it seems to me that will have to be different narratives for different recipients of the narrative. So the enlightened self-interest, I think, works well in some fields. I think in the recipient country, what I'm trying to say is if in Sierra Leone it became abundantly clear that actually we'd only gone out there because of our fears for ourselves, that would have played completely wrong. I mean, you know, we think we'll all agree that. So there's an element of, is that just a subtext that we are aware of, or is it something we're very overt about, and how does one balance those?
I think one of the one argument that I've used quite commonly, which I think does go down quite well, is that one of stability. That essentially if we go to a country with the explanation that we're helping them because if we can make their food production more stable and reliable, then they become a much more stable country and they're a happy country, and ultimately, particularly now, we are looking for trading partners. So that can play quite well from the animal perspective. From the human perspective, I'd have to think about that, about an equally cogent argument that would play well in those countries. But I take your point.
I'm going to move on to David.
Thanks. This has been very interesting. When I think of global health security, though, I think of the need to change the paradigm. You know, today when we speak of global health security, whether it's at the global level or at the national level, we're thinking about detecting in humans, who are really a sentinel population for zoonoses in many cases, and then respond. Sometimes that respond requires culling of animals. Sometimes it requires more drastic measures or less drastic measures. But we're still thinking globally and nationally about good surveillance, detecting, and responding. If we were to take this paradigm and shift it further, what I think we'd all like to see for global health security is prevention at the source. And so how do we get there? And it's a very difficult journey to get from where all the money is being placed today, especially globally, on these elaborate defense mechanisms, global surveillance activities, response mechanisms. But the UK has shown that there is a way to step forward and to step into that prevention mode through their HARES group, the Human Animal Infections Risk Surveillance Group, which once a month meets between agriculture, environment, health, food security. All the different groups meet once a month. look at what's going on in the world and see how that might apply to the UK. You said it, Trevor, earlier, a bit about how that works. And this is very important. This is moving one step, shifting one step from detection and response to being prepared, to looking and seeing what the risks are, what the risks could be, and how you can deal with them. And if there isn't enough information, that information is collected before the next month's meeting. The one thing that lacks in this, Virginia, is adding disasters to this. And that could be added, and you need to be lobbying to see how that can be added to this.
Who convenes HARES? Who's the...
Public Health England.
Well, there you
So
go.
that's an area where all hazards could be included, not just animal-human health. But if you look on the web and look at the HARES strategy, it's really quite a wonderful strategy, which should be adopted by many countries. I know Australia, Adam, has used the HARES strategy in their monthly risk assessments as well. So that's getting from detection in humans response to assessing the risks and being ready for them. But there's also moving way back, and that's to the prevention, to looking to see how to prevent these infections in animals or in humans. But that becomes even more complicated because the bottom lines are different for prevention in humans and prevention in animals. Prevention in humans, the bottom line is save lives and prevent illness. In animals, it's prevent illness, save lives, but it's also make a profit. And that's where it becomes really difficult to shift that paradigm back to prevention. So there needs to be a lot of research or a lot of study to see what are the cost-effective prevention interventions at the animal-human interface that can really help us to move back to prevention at the source, rather than just this continued detect and respond and devastate economies.
Thank you very much. Comments on that? Virginia, do you want to add a point about HARES?
I agree with you that HARES is an incredibly valuable group, and it has been used more widely, David. And I think PHE should be very proud of the work that it's led, and thanks to Dilys and many others. There's also a parallel chair as a chemical risk assessment group, which I know goes forward and has been doing a lot of work. And I think that's an interesting approach. But I think what you've really demonstrated, which I think is so elegant, is the need for this partnership working. And just going on to the website of HARES, you can see that it's not only PHE, but DEFRA have a huge role, which is fantastic. So do the Animal and Plant Health Agency, and thank you for all the work and the international forward look you've been so supportive of. DH, Public Health Wales, Welsh Government, Health Protection Scotland, Scottish Government, Public Health Agency of Northern Ireland, the Department of Agriculture, Environment, Rural Affairs, Northern Ireland, and the Food Standards Agency. So it's that incredible partnership process that I think is so powerful. And I think that is the way that really practical global health security is brought forward, and I think that's really useful. But you called for me to suggest that disaster should be included much more widely, and I think what it does is offers a brilliant example of how we can work and how we can be early in trying to do the disaster risk reduction, because it works well, and I think that's the great privilege, and it was so much needed after the foot and mouth incident you referred to. And these things really concern me, that if we don't get this right, this partnership working, we'll miss one thing after another. And in a world that is so small, where we're not looking after it properly, we really need every element of good practice to come together. And I think that's a great way forward, and I know I'll say it again, but bringing those frameworks together, but also using the things that are already there, like Sendai, where you have risk assessment, risk understanding, governance, investing, and how to do it for response, recovery, and reconstruction and rehabilitation. You know, a lot of it is there, so we just need to open the doors and make sure that we're listening and that health is really engaged, and it would be wonderful if we can do that, and I think the partnership with many would be just fantastic, if we can.
Can I ask, and this is my ignorance, so is HARES, it sounds to me like HARES is the structure within the UK that all those groups are talking to each other on a regular basis.
Yes.
So that seems to be sorted. Neil, I'm looking to Neil to kind of give because Public Health England is it fair to ask you to comment on that? Could that be the basis of something even more collaborative across sector?
Well, I think it's definitely an element of it, but if you want to broaden it out, I mean, as Virginia's already suggested, to broader disaster risk reduction, then I mean the Sendai framework currently has a monitoring framework that in the UK that's coordinated by the Cabinet Office, which really does bring together all government departments. And so the requirement is that every government department reports on what it's doing to comply with the framework. So HARES would be part of that, but I mean, clearly if you want the broader all hazards response, then you need to have an overarching framework. Which is why, I mean, sort of just coming back to sort of, this other question about sort of what is the UK exporting. So it's not about exporting a particular model. It's about identifying ways of working which can be applied in different contexts. And so of the partners who need to be around the table when we're working internationally, clearly the Department for International Development is critically important because they will help ensure that we're very aware of the resource constraints that many other countries face, so that they do make choices between health and education. And therefore, when we're making recommendations about what is necessary to be in place for global health security, those are made in full knowledge of the acute resource limitations that would prevent a comprehensive response. And then you can then bring in health economic expertise, planning expertise, which can help make a series of rational decisions based upon best possible evidence of what will make the biggest impact. So what we're wanting really is to bring together a variety of different sources of information which corresponds to the range of hazards that countries face, which will be different depending on where the country is located, whether it's volcanic or whether it's low-lying. So each country is going to face a different set of risks. There's no sort of tailor-made response or sort of bespoke. I mean, you need bespoke responses that are based upon assessment of need, which is why we're beginning to get that with joint external evaluations, but they're not comprehensive. But what the point I was making about the need for effective coordination, collaboration amongst UK partners is that the message we should be delivering when we're engaging internationally is that communication between all of the key stakeholders is critically important to success. There isn't a simple solution, but unless you communicate, unless you share information, unless you consult widely, then you're not going to get an appropriate response. And these decisions that are made on the basis of these analyses will have cost implications, and therefore those need to be weighed up within the context of a national financing framework. Normally one of the things that DFID does when it's providing aid to other countries, particularly poor countries, is to look at the overall financing framework. It'll be talking to the World Bank, it'll be looking at the financing infrastructures. And it will be trying to make sure that the resource allocation decisions are not distorting of national priority mechanisms. And therefore we as partners harmonise our support and align behind national priority settings and don't undermine national governance mechanisms. So all of these things need to come into place. And the only way of achieving a coordinated UK offer really is talking amongst ourselves first before we go and talk to other governments. Otherwise, what tends to happen currently is we go to them individually, we all sell our specialist interest, we continue to give an uncoordinated message, and we're not actually helping the situation. So if we can coordinate in the UK first, then we'll be far more effective in being a global player when we act internationally, but responding to nationally defined priorities rather than forcing an agenda. And that's how we differentiate ourselves from players like the US. We tend to be pushing a US agenda rather than responding to nationally identified needs.
Thank you. David, did you want to say? Oh, sorry, yes. Claire, you go then, David. Yeah.
I was just going to say about your national priorities, that kind of leads into the question you asked about, Mitali, about kind of who should be involved, and follows on from what Louis was saying about when you've got a choice between education or health. And you have to have, when you're going to these countries to put, to say this is what we can bring, you've got to make sure you've got the right people in the room at that end, right? And that's got to be the Cabinet Office or senior ministers or even, leaders, right? They've got to be the country leaders to be able to say, okay, well, our priorities this year are education, but how can you got to talk to them to get the priorities to include health security in whatever form it should look like? And then you've got to then have not only that leader, but then all the other sectors that you're going to be working with. So you can't just talk to the Department of Health or Ministry of Health in a country. but you need to have political buy-in of the leadership, and then the leadership coordinate. Okay, well, you also need to talk to. I mean, I'm guessing they've not. Most countries you'll be deploying to won't have the same setup that the UK has, but they will have some sort of agricultural ministry or some sort of health ministry, education ministry. But you need the oversight of the leadership of the, political, the leader of the country or the cabinet office equivalent to get the buy-in, to make it happen, to ensure that whatever you're doing fits with the national priorities, and also the national priorities incorporate a broader health agenda.
And just to be clear, are we saying that because we're just good people and we're better than the people who try to impose their own agenda, or because it's more effective if we go? I mean, is it a moral thing or is it an effectiveness thing?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, the main thing is issues of sovereignty, right? So states aren't going to want you coming in there and changing what their plans are.
But we do that all the time, don't we? I mean, people like Britain and America in the past have done that. China, you might argue, the states, what I'm trying to say is that it's never entirely disinterested, is it?
No.
In fact, it's largely not disinterested.
Yeah.
So, just picking up on Neil's point, you kind of seem to be implying that we're just terribly wonderful, and which of course we are.
So there was the Paris, Accra and Busan, so there's a whole series of international agreements on aid harmonization and alignment which recognise that donors do distort and do dictate to other partners, and if we want to effectively enable and empower other countries to fulfil their democratic mandate to their population, we need to harmonise and align behind their support. So it's just a continuation of that. Now, in the health sector, we have instruments such as IHP plus the International Health Partnership. Now, that's a health sector specific one. But what we're saying is that for things like the Sendai, now we've recognised in the UK that we need to have a multi-sectoral coordination mechanism. Here it's the Cabinet Office. In other countries, there aren't necessarily multi-sectoral coordination mechanisms. So we do need to explore with partners what would be a suitable multi-sectoral coordination mechanism, recognising that it probably won't be health-led. And therefore we do need to make sure that the partners in the room are the right ones to achieve the level of political leverage necessary.
That's very helpful answer. David, did you want to?
I was just going to say, when you do get this package, there has been a precedent here. I mean, it's because of the UK that AMR is on the agenda. And that's gone to both the World Health Organization and to the UN. And it's because of the Chief Medical Officer's dogged desire to get this on the global agenda that it's there. And that was a strategy which included the O'Neill report, which included a whole series of activities which led to the UN. And I think that's one way of driving this agenda. The UN, the UK develops it and sends it off to the UN, but another way is just through the soft power of bilateral relations, and maybe both are important.
Yeah. Trevor.
Yeah, and I just wondered, your original question about are we better than the US at doing this? I think actually what Britain is a lot more sensitive to accusations of neocolonialism than America, I'm afraid, and I think that's ultimately why we're rather better at it than they are.
Very good. And I mean, China hasn't been mentioned in this conversation very much. I mean, China, someone said, is taking a more kind of colonial approach, a bit of a land grab, but at the same time, it's going to be hugely influential, isn't it, on global health security?
Yes, I've had extensive working in China, and it's very clear, and they make no bones about it, that they see Africa, for instance, as its garden.
Yeah.
And they will be utilising and exploiting Africa essentially to provide their food over the next 50, 100 years. So that's the main reason why they're investing in that region.
And people talk about the UK approach to all of this. So should we be, by whatever means, trying to influence China to take a different approach? I mean, explicit or implicit? I mean, is there a benefit? If the UK approach is successful, what would we?
Yeah, for the same reasons of neocolonialism, I think UK is actually rather less well placed because China's immediate response is, well, you did it.
Yeah, true. Virginia, there's a microphone there. Microphone there, sorry, Lisa. Thanks.
Sorry, forgive me. I'm sure you know the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm not sure everybody else is aware of. It's the most incredible program they have, and I had the great privilege of going to the Chinese Academy of Science as it was launched in November last year.
Just say the name again.
It is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. It comes from the Silk Belt and the Maritime Road through the sea. So it is very much following the old silk pathways which China used to export a lot of its goods. And it really is including about 100 countries in the world and engaging with them with all sorts of processes about transport, finance and many other things. But it does include a very strong element of disaster risk reduction. And I had the privilege of sitting on one of their advisory groups for that purpose. I think I think as a global initiative, it's very exciting, and I think it's really important that from the Global Health Security Initiative, and I'm fully aware that the Chinese Centre for Disease Control is engaged in it, that we try to work to support it because they do have an innovative approach that may be of great relevance to deliver this. And I think it's time we had more from the East to inform the West.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think it's, in practical terms, very, I'd like to see the world that everyone just does the right thing because we're all good people and altruistic, but I think that's probably not the way it really works most times. And also maybe the way in many cases that it shouldn't work, because after all, a lot of this comes from taxpayer dollars, so a UK or a US citizen does have the right to say, what am I getting out of this? But I think more it's an issue of transparency, basically, and kind of stating what we're doing and why we're doing, and that, yeah, we do have expectations and what we want out of it. And some of the politics also, if we, for example, we talked earlier about the security element. If we took the security element out of that, there's some of those dollars that might go away, for example. A lot of the tools that we had to at least try to put in place in terms of therapeutics and vaccines for Ebola came because the U.S. is so concerned about Ebola as for bioterrorism, and we wouldn't have had any of those tools if we didn't. So there's that, if you will, in quotes, good part kind of the politics that we need to be sensitive to, and I don't think we necessarily want to even cut that out. I just think we need to be reasonably transparent about how we express it.
And I guess when any of us are negotiating a deal, if someone comes to us with what looks like a free lunch, we wonder why they're there. I mean, I think a honesty about the win-win, which is kind of enlightened self-interest by another name, I guess. We should probably finish the panel discussion and begin to wrap up. Don't feel you have to move. So I'll just give a few remarks. But before I do, I wondered if David and Gavin, and I'm going to say Neil as well, because although overtly it was Chatham House and ABT and the BMJ, I know Public Health England's been enormously important in organising this. And then Matali, you might like to say any final words, and then I'll round up. So I'm going to start with Gavin. Any final remarks on the day and what you hope to get and where you think we could go now, just briefly?
Yeah, thank you, Fiona. This has been a wonderful day. I've met many new people, so this has been an absolute pleasure. This is always part of my goal when I travel to, again, meet new passionate friends and to start to work towards doing great things. Again, I think a lot of the themes that we've discussed today are still things that we're still struggling with. We're still finding challenging. The framework, the definition, the communication, the collaboration, the cooperation, but getting people directly moving forward to ensure that we have sustainable funding streams. We've heard the terms multidisciplinary, intersectorial, multisectorial, but then how to operationalise those. What do they look like? We often are so challenged in when we work with many governments, all wonderful people, but getting all these 11 departments or 11 ministries into one room to talk about a common agenda. It's really hard. One of the discussions we had here, I think is something as a takeaway, the Ministry of Health doesn't bury dead people. And a lot of the disease outbreaks, both animal or human, we're dealing with either dead animals or dead people, and they don't do that. And so it's other departments, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Labour, Ministry of Transport, that may be involved in that, and often they don't they aren't part of the planning process. And I thought the comments about the Ministry of Defence, Department of Defence, the military, every disaster, be natural or infectious diseases, for me, they've always turned up. But they've never been part of the planning process, the prevention process, as both David and Neil highlighted. And again, how do we engage that now in peacetime to ensure that we use valuable resources, but we use them in a way that's appropriate and not threatening to governments or to the community.
And Gavin, just one word, if you would, on what next, what now from this meeting? What would you like to see?
I'd like to see us expand our scope. We know that we work very closely with the UN, with FAO, OIE, WHO. I'd like us to expand our scope a little bit to what Virginia was talking about in disaster risk reduction, and what I've been talking about in operationalising emergency operation centres. Bring all those necessary partners to the table that actually have decision-making authority on those critical mission functions.
And who should convene? Are we talking UK? We're talking what's the kind of convening group? I suppose I'm trying to think of is what can we in this room do? What's the next step for us in this room?
I think this is a great forum for us, Fiona. It's non-threatening. It's a pleasure to be here at the BMJ. And again, this is where I find if we can find a non-threatening organisation that is, the BMJ is very good at convening. Your conferences around the world, lots of people attend those conferences because you're very good at identifying the themes, good speakers, good topics, good discussion. So again, find that sort of non-threatening, neutral, convening organisation that can bring sort of the many multidisciplinary, multi-sectorial organisations, both public, private and academia, to the table. And again, we'll have more of these discussions.
Thank you very much. David?
I'm not sure what the next step should be, but I think the challenge is to keep the emphasis of the global health agenda, security agenda, on strengthening public health capacity and health resilience in all countries. And I think that has to be the final goal, because we don't want these mechanisms that have to intervene and stop disease when it occurs. We want to get the capacity into all countries, including the UK, including the US, all countries, to be able to deal with these issues on their own. So how do we take this global health security agenda, which means different things to different people, it's the chameleon as we said earlier, and make it strengthen public health capacity and health resilience in all countries?
Okay. And just more concretely, I think that's really great. You've actually encapsulated the challenge there. What would you like to see people in this room do, or people who aren't here but should be?
I'd like to see the UK lead the way on this.
Okay. Neil?
This terms of mutual self-interest was mentioned, but the November 2015 AIDS strategy is in our mutual interest, and that's the beginning of shifting the narrative on the use of the aid budget in the UK, recognising that to justify to the UK taxpayer why their money is being spent internationally in a time of austerity, we need to articulate there are benefits from the UK from this. So I think this group is important for evolving the narrative for a UK domestic audience of why we operate internationally, because it is in our interest, but also in developing the narrative for the global audience, in that it's in everybody's interest that we have a secure world, just because we've seen what the consequences could be. And it's no good just highlighting risks without at least suggesting solutions. So part of the solution is that we do need to begin to take forward and address strategically some of the main risks. And we've identified how to do that through recognising the major risk of climate change, sort of looking at an approach, the SDGs, beginning to identify a framework of indicators to address them in Sendai and other risk indicators. So that we've got tools that we need to now deliver. And really what this group could do is begin to convene all of the necessary stakeholders to begin to get that coordinated UK offer in support of a WHO-led international response.
Mitali, tell us what you'd like to see next.
So I'm relatively new to the global health security work that's happening, and this meeting was really from a very early conversation that Neil and I had. So, first of all, thank you everyone for being here today. The discussion's been fascinating. As someone quite new to this, I thought actually that we would be further progressed. And in my naivety and hope, I thought the discussion would be much more about implementation and action, and actually really a lot of the discussion's been about, how we define security, whether security should be part of the language or not. And I'm quite pragmatic in all of this, I suppose. And I think we have the phrase, we have the agenda, we have the JEs and the action packages. And for me, it's more about how do we use the political kind of will that we've got at the moment, and use the funding that's available to try and achieve all of our mutual objectives around the broader public health landscape and health system strengthening and all of those other good things, which I believe we can do through the lens of global health security. So for me, that's where I'd like to see the discussion move to, really, over the next few months and years, and hopefully we can convene another meeting jointly with PHE, DH and DFID and others in the autumn to take forward some of these themes. And I would like to see us really bringing together all of the good work that's happening in the UK and showcasing that internationally and disseminating the outputs of research and the good practice going on the ground as well. So that's where I'd like to take this.
Very helpful. So let me just try and summarise in the last 3 minutes available to us. I think I think we're saying we'd like the UK to lead. We'd like to have a cohesive, compelling narrative around the UK, what the UK can offer, and we would like to make sure that is. It seems to me we've got to involve the other parts of the world we're trying to work with in this. So whatever the next meeting is, the next discussion needs to be rather more representative, but with a very much a focus on the UK's role. I think that would be manageable given the scope of the challenge. I can imagine a meeting perhaps in September, October time, maybe towards the end of the year, as you've said, with PHE, with DH, with DFID, with other players. And what we might try to do as an output from that meeting is create a kind of collection of content. But in the meantime, we've got BMJ Global Health, which is going to have a report of this meeting. The BMJ is always open to any ideas for articles that might help to stimulate discussion. We will be in touch with you all, I think, with a follow-up from the meeting, asking for your further ideas, because no doubt, over the next few weeks you will have those. And we will continue the discussions with Chatham House, PHE, ABT Associates to try and frame that meeting for later on in the year. So, thank you very much indeed. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I've certainly learnt a lot, and we really would welcome your feedback. What's the best way, Mitali, for people to send their comments? I guess what we'll do is we'll send an email to you all, thanking you for being here, and if you could use that as your prompt to send us back any remaining comments, we'd be really grateful to have those. And always can email me, fgodley@bmj.com. Very glad to hear from you. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you, everyone.